to episode 18 of FTCE Seminar, a teacher certification podcast. I'm your host, Mercedes Musto. In today's episode, I'll be talking about how to use a podcast to study so you can learn. Let's get started. Here are 5 podcasting study tips. Tip number 1, listening time. Are you a morning listener or a middle of the night listener? Or maybe you like to put on your earbuds in the early afternoon while enjoying a midday latte. Hey, you do you, right? Tip number 1, listening time, means exploring what time of day works best for you. At first, I thought that I could listen to an educational podcast like while driving or cleaning the house, but research shows that students prefer listening to podcasts while sitting on the couch or laying in bed. In fact, many students are wholly focused on listening without interruptions. How cool is that? Tip number 2, play, then pause. To get the most out of an educational podcast, use the skill of active listening. Active listening requires us to be fully present, giving our full attention to the speaker. What this means is to use active listening along with tip number 2, play, then pause. We play, then pause the podcast to concentrate on the concepts being shared. The pause gives us information processing time to really digest what we need to learn. Add active listening to your play then pause technique to get the most out of an educational podcast. Tip number 3, replay to reinforce. Replay is one of the best characteristics of a podcast. Not only can you pause to process what you've learned on the podcast, but then you can go back and replay the section you found interesting or confusing, or hey, maybe you got a little distracted, right? I mean, yeah, this never happens to me, But for real, while you are deeply focused in active listening, you may want to pause the podcast, go back a few seconds, and replay the concept. Replaying or repeating information reinforces what you know. Try tip number 3, replay to reinforce. Tip number 4, take notes. I probably could have made this tip number 1, but I didn't. Either way, you can go back and replay this podcast, then pause it and take notes. Boom! It all makes so much sense now. So this is how it works. First, go to FTCE Seminar and get yourself a practice test for, the FTCE or the Professional Education Exam or even the Elementary Education Exam. Then take the practice test. How did you do? Let's say you found the English language skills section of the General Knowledge practice test particularly challenging. What do you do now? You plug into Spotify, Audible, or YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, practice some active listening, press pause, take notes, and replay the concepts you need to reinforce your knowledge. Educational podcasting is such a chill way to study. Put on an episode, take notes on your iPad, sip on a cafe latte, then share your notes with friends. Sweet. Collaboration. That's how it's done. And now, tip number 5, discuss and share. We've talked a lot about how to get the most out of an educational podcast. The last tip number 5, is to discuss and share. Form a study group with people who are, preparing for the same exam and share study resources. Discussing what you've learned not only helps you comprehend the material, but it also helps you practice your knowledge of content through dialogue. Sometimes we just need to talk things out with another person to gain the perspective and encouragement we need before taking the test. So discuss and share these tips with another person and offer encouragement. You'll be thankful you did. Let's review. Use these 5 tips to get the most out of an educational podcast. Tip number 1, choose a good time of day to listen, whatever works for you. Tip number 2, play, then pause so you can really focus on the concepts. Tip number 3, replay to reinforce what you've learned. I love this idea. Tip number 4, take notes. Whether it's on your phone or tablet, jot down a few notes while you're listening. And tip number 5, discuss and share. This is always good advice. Learn something new, discuss and share. Have trouble with a concept? Discuss and share. Like this podcast? That's right. Discuss and share. For more study hacks, visit ftceseminar.com. You can also visit us on Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast player to start studying. The important thing is to start studying and start studying today. Well, what are you waiting for? Check us out on YouTube at FTCE Seminar and start studying today. This is your host, Mercedes Musto. Join me again on FTCE Seminar, a teacher certification podcast. Shout out to UWF. This podcast was recorded at the Pickens Multimedia Studio at the University of West Florida.